Because of the particular type of Latinist I am, where I did my training in classical Latin, but I spend most of my time reading post-classical Latin. I get asked a lot of questions about the relationship between ecclesiastical and classical Latin. And I think there's a lot of misconception about what we mean when we start talking about those two things and what the relationship is. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to address that and clear some of that stuff up. Maybe the first and most important thing to say is that ecclesiastical and classical Latin are two different versions of the Latin language. Neither one of them is the language itself, so that you would look at classical as the thing and ecclesiastical as this weird offshoot of it, or vice versa. Rather, they are two examples of ways of using the Latin language. And I'll motivate that claim that classical Latin is not sort of the language in itself in precisely this way. What we refer to as classical Latin is a Latin whose rules are determined largely by the literary usage of Cicero and Caesar. There are other Virgil's a part of that, but really Cicero and Caesar are the big boys in terms of setting out what are the boundaries for classical Latin language. This language is highly formalized and highly stylized, and was in fact the ordinary everyday language of no one ever. It is a specialized language that was used for literary affect. It should be compared to the language of Shakespeare, the language of Milton, not to the language of the New York Times or something of that sort. We can tell this for a variety of reasons. One is, if you go back and look before Cicero and Caesar, and you look at older Latin like Plautus and Naevius and some of these guys, and even Sallust, who is often imitating an older form of Latin, even though he came after Cicero. If you look at those older forms of Latin, one of the things that you notice is that a lot of the rules that we learn in classical Latin aren't followed. Rules such as certain verbs like parco take a dative. Pre-Cicero Caesar, they take an accusative. They don't take a dative. See, they work how you would expect that they would. Most of those 65 Latin words that take a dative case, as its normal case for its object, we can find them in earlier Latin with an accusative case, just as we'll find them in later Latin with the accusative case. So there was clearly a different way of doing things earlier on. Now, it's not the case that we should think, well, of course, Plautus, that's, those are comedies. It's like saying that, this is street talk that he's just brought into the plays here. Well, interestingly, we do have on record, Cicero makes a comment about the language of this elderly Roman matron, and he says, her language is so elegant, it reminds me of Plautus and Naevius. So in Cicero's mind, Plautus doesn't represent vulgar, common street Latin. It represents an elegant aristocratic Latin. It represents an educated Latin. And much the same way that while we may have some vulgar elements of English represented in Shakespeare's plays, nevertheless, the vast majority of Shakespeare's diction is quite elevated. It's not the common speech of Elizabethan England on the street. But there's further evidence for this too. If we move outside of Cicero's discourses in the Senate and his letters to his most educated friends and start looking at things like letters to his wife, we find him using a very different sort of language. And we find him breaking a lot of the rules that we have that are based upon the way he speaks in his speeches and his court cases. So I think what this helps us to see is that the language that we're calling classical Latin is a literary construction. It's a high stylized literary language that was in use for a period of time in the empire, but at the same time that it was being used, it coexisted with a more informal, more natural form of the language that didn't have as many of the very rules that often make Latin hard for our students to learn it. So that's why we shouldn't see classical Latin as like the real thing. It is an affectation. It's a specialized language. It's gorgeous. It's Shakespeare, for goodness sake, right? And so this is not to put it down, but it's not the way the language would have been spoken by the average educated Roman on the street. Ecclesiastical Latin is a development of where Latin went, and I think it's very important not to get confused and put too many things together here. It's not as if all Latin after classical Latin ended is ecclesiastical Latin in the sense that's meaningful. Because ecclesiastical Latin is specifically the language of the church. And there's a whole other use of Latin that is not the language of the church that's going on. But they're fairly close they're much closer together, I think, than classical Latin was with vulgar Latin of its day. Ecclesiastical Latin is a development of Latin in the direction of, therefore, it has to pick up two different strands. One is the liturgical and theological trajectory of the church moving out of the late Empire and into the Middle Ages. And so, as the language was taken up by the church, both in worship and in reflection on the scriptures and the Christian life, that's an important aspect of what we mean by ecclesiastical Latin. But the other trajectory is that everyday talk, which would go on and continue in these countries for several centuries into the eventual rise of the vernaculars, and would remain the language of the educated classes for 1,000 years after the vernaculars arose. That's also part of what we mean by ecclesiastical Latin. And so in many ways, post-classical Latin might be a better moniker, although that's got its own problems. So what is the difference then between ecclesiastical and classical Latin? Well, obviously there are some pronunciation differences, but that's largely cosmetic. The pronunciation differences are a particularly strong form of a dialectical difference, but at the end of the day, they're really nothing other than a dialectical difference. And I've argued in another video that language is determined by grammar. This is Latin because it has this grammar. Ecclesiastical Latin is Latin because it still has Latin's grammar. It hasn't become Italian or Spanish or something like that. So the differences between classical Latin and ecclesiastical Latin are not primarily grammatical. Every grammatical construction that is at use in the classical period is also at use in the ecclesiastical period. It's just that a lot of the other constructions that did not get used in classical Latin, but that did exist in Plautus and continued on in the spoken language out of which classical Latin came, those are also in medieval Latin. So you have to know the classical rules, but you can't be pedantic about them because those rules will sometimes hold and they sometimes won't within the same author, on the same page even. They'll do it both ways because they see all of these grammatical constructions as possibilities. It's all tools they can use for expressing what it is they're trying to express. So then I would characterize the difference between them as this. Ecclesiastical Latin differs from classical Latin largely in terms of syntactical emphasis. It does emphasize different sorts of things and different sorts of usages than classical Latin did. It's more comfortable with prepositions than classical Latin was. It'll use them more frequently. It leans to certain constructions more than others. That will vary by genre. It will vary by country. It will vary by century. It will vary by the level of education of the writer. It's a very massive field of usage. It's a whole bunch of stuff as these guys are exploring the corners of the Latin language, whether because they think it's interesting or because that's all they know. That's what their little part of the world has learned to say. But it's not fundamentally a different language. So sometimes people wonder, okay, should I be studying ecclesiastical or classical Latin? Well, that's down to what are you going to be reading. And I think the question of pronunciation is the same thing. I pronounce Latin both ways. I read classical Latin writers with a classical pronunciation and ecclesiastical writers and later Latin writers with an ecclesiastical pronunciation. But that's so I don't think it's the pronunciations aren't so difficult that one shouldn't bother learning both. But at the end of the day, it's about what are you going to be reading? Why are you learning Latin, right? If you want to learn it for the entire breadth of the language, I recommend learning to pronounce it both ways. Because you want to hear each author with the tonalities that they're hearing. You might pick up on things you would otherwise miss if you didn't do that. Different types of assonances, because sometimes a phonetic assonance will also bring in a conceptual assonance. If you want to read of a variety of things, you're interested in both Cicero and Augustine and Erasmus, then that's fine. I would say study classical Latin because you've got to know all that stuff anyway, and then start reading in medieval Latin and paying attention to the things that are different, and read medieval Latin with a good teacher who can guide you through, yeah, that's really common, or no, that's super weird. I don't see that very often at all, or whatever else. My students are required to be able to read classical and medieval Latin, and my view is if you're a Latinist and it's in Latin, you're responsible for it. And so when I do things like my Reading Latin course, Reading Latin Practicum, or my Sua Borbis summer course, I'm careful to draw Latin from across classical, medieval, and Renaissance, and sometimes often even contemporary Latin as well, just to make sure that they are getting a full range of experience with the entirety of the language. So there's a little bit, hopefully that helps in terms of thinking about what the difference between those two are. Again, it's quite slight. If you can read classical Latin, you can read medieval Latin, although you might constantly be scandalized. If you can read medieval Latin, you can read classical Latin, although there might be some things that you don't remember because they were way early. They were back when you learned the language and you haven't seen them a lot, and all of a sudden they're coming up here. You might have to brush up on some of that kind of stuff. But they are fundamentally one language, and it's quite easy to teach the language from that standpoint.